In 1991, I photographed the paintings of Ajanta, these 5th century paintings which are hidden in the darkness of caves in Western India. These are the most revered and the most beautiful paintings of the entire Buddhist tradition. In all the countries of Asia, they speak reverentially of this site. The paintings of Ajanta changed my life. The gentle beings of the art permeated my consciousness. Every time I looked at the paintings, I was carried away. There was an infinite warmth, humility and compassion in these paintings. It was expressed in every gesture, in every glance. It was indeed a world of compassion which took me over completely. A journey began to discover the philosophy, the vision of life which underlies these great paintings. Leading experts on Buddhist art said that my photographs showed the Ajanta paintings in their true and luminous colors for the first time. Universities, museums and cultural institutions from around the world invited me to come and lecture on these paintings. Everywhere, people responded with warmth to the sensitivity and compassion contained in the art of Ajanta. These are in fact the very qualities which people associate with Buddhism. However, many asked questions about current practices in Buddhism, particularly in the Himalayan regions. These appear to be rather different from the early compassionate faith. Was this Buddhism really? How did these changes come about? Join me on a journey through the history of Buddhism. Let us see how these transformations took place in Buddhist practice. Gautama Siddhartha was one of humanity's wisest teachers. He was born in 563 BCE, the son of Sudhodana, the ruler of the Shakya clan. Sudhodana ruled from the town of Kapilavastu in the present-day state of Uttar Pradesh in India. At the age of 35, Gautama attained Bodhi, the knowledge of the eternal truth. Gautama Siddhartha taught a profound ethical message to the many followers who soon gathered around him. He spoke of the pain in our lives and pointed out that this was because of our own desires. The way to do away with the pain was to lose our desires. The majority of Buddhists belong to the earlier austere form of Theravada Buddhism. They believe that it is through self-discipline that they can give up worldly attachments to proceed on the path to salvation. There are also Mahayana Buddhists. They believe in bodhisattvas. Bodhisattvas are beings on their way to enlightenment who have delayed their own salvation to help others on the path. Besides self-discipline and personal development in order to lose our confusions and desires, we can also pray to them for their help. And then there are the Vajrayana Buddhists in the Himalayan regions of India, in Tibet, southern China, Mongolia and in Japan. They appear to follow colorful and magical practices. They seem to be very far from the concepts of Buddhism as we understand them. The Cham dance of the Lamas signifies the victory of knowledge over ignorance. In Buddhist thought, the greatest evil is the ego. It is that sense of the self which is the greatest illusion which we must lose in order to gain true knowledge. The masks cover the ordinary day-to-day nature of the men and present instead the qualities of the deities within them. There are peaceful masks and those with wrathful expressions. To understand the practices of the lamas and to understand the history of later Buddhism, we have to turn to Nalanda and other universities of Eastern India. In the first millennium, great Buddhist monasteries were established in the plains of Eastern India and in Kashmir. These were intellectual centers where the science of the mind was studied in great detail. The finest intellectuals analyzed the path, the steps on the path towards Buddhahood or true knowledge. They sought to create a logical path which would lead us step by step towards that knowledge, a path which would work for all. These vast universities had hundreds of teachers and students who came from across India and from the many countries of Asia that had embraced Buddhist philosophy. The greatest of these was here at Nalanda. Here there was a spirit of vibrant intellectual thought, a climate of discussion and debate.
This institution, Takshashila and Nalanda and later Brikamalashila. Now then these, not like monastery, but these really become academic center.
One of the most important universities in the world was developed not in the medieval West, but right here in India. And here I'm referring to the university consortium of Nalanda, Vikramashila, Somapura, Odantapuri. All of these various universities were instrumental in producing people who were capable of understanding and articulating what it means to have universal knowledge, knowledge that's applicable across cultures and across times. And really what we're talking about here, when we're talking about revolution, is a change in perspective. It's a complete change in the way we perceive and thus experience the world. This information might appear arcane or esoteric, but in fact, the most interesting thing about it is that it is very clearly about consciousness itself. It's about every one of us. And it's about, in the end, something quite simple. And that simple thing is the transformation of our negative impulses into their positive counterparts. And this is the central doctrine of Yoga Tantra and Anuttara Yoga Tantra as they were developed in the great universities of the Indian plains in the medieval period.
The deities revered in Tibet were conceived in the monasteries of Eastern India. The earliest known images of Tara are all to be found in the 5th-6th century Buddhist caves of Maharashtra. The first Buddhist mandala in art is seen in the mid-5th century Kanheri caves. The first 11-headed Avalokiteshvara is also seen in a 5th-6th century cave at Kanheri.
Religion is a word which is very loose expression. I don't know whether Buddhism should be put in the connotation of religion or not. If we are very strictly speaking, the religion has its own connotation. Buddhism is different from all other religious tradition is that there's no place for unanalyzed faith or something which is to be accepted without any one's own understanding or one's own logical conclusions.
Now you see the differences. Buddhism, like Jainism, we have no concept of creator. So one's own salvation must achieve through one's own effort. Now, the main obstacle about salvation is ignorance. There are many different levels of ignorance. So logically, the antidote of ignorance is knowledge, not prayer. And then also, you see, the basic Buddhist approach is from this level, without sort of waiting blessing, but one's own sort of effort, and step by step become Buddhahood. So therefore, in order to practice effectively, we have to know about mind, about emotion. So therefore, those Buddhist texts, also including some Hindu sort of tradition where practice of shamatha and vipassana there, naturally the explanation about mind automatically come. So therefore, that part I consider science. So today, now last few years, I think over 1 decade, I think number of Western medical scientists and also the brain sort of scientists, now they're really showing interest to get information, explanation from Eastern Indian ancient thought about emotion, about mind. So they found very, very useful information in order to know the reality about the world of emotion, world of mind. So that I consider as a science. Then concept of impermanence, or concept of interdependency. This also itself is simply sort of out of their investigation or analyze the reality, then they develop this sort of new concept about reality. Now, in physics, also now they realize the atomic level. Every moment is changing, moving like that. One time, one of my friend, the Raja Ramana, Indian sort of nuclear physicist, once he told me he found the concept of quantum physics found some of the Nagarjuna's sort of writing. So he, as an Indian, he feels very proud. The quantum physics in the world is quite new. But in ancient Indian thought, 2,000 years ago, already have these concepts. So therefore, these things, not as a religious subject, but academic subject. So these Nalanda master sort of writing really useful for academic field.
Something which is so unique of Nalanda University in terms of its knowledge and wisdom is the tremendous logic, tremendous metaphysics, and the tremendous study of epistemology, which are all utilized to bring about incredible depth of the warmth in the human being.
स्टडीज़ का जो फिलोसफी का केंद्र बना है वो सबसे बड़ा केंद्र शायद नालंदा बना है और वहाँ के विद्वान लोगों ने मतलब जैसे हमने बोला डिबेट जो सिस्टम है, जो कि जिसको हम लोग टिबेटन में थिंगी बोलते हैं या इंग्लिश में डिबेट है, तो डिबेट के माध्यम से वो ऐसा नहीं बल्कि जस्ट आपको इंट्रोड्यूस किया, इसके बाद में आप उसको विचार में रख लिया, इतना नहीं, बल्कि एक एक पहलू पर और सालों सालों तक, वो भी बड़े बड़े विद्वान लोग जो भी बहुत बुद्धिमान लोग एक एक पहलू को मेरा ख्याल से साल साल तक अध्ययन करके कुछ नतीजे पर पहुंच के इन्होंने इस फिलोसफी को, इस ट्रेडिशन को आगे बढ़ाया है.
India is having the galaxy of scholars. These Nalanda, especially the Vikramshila University, was the many more scholars. It is very difficult to pinpoint this is the scholar.
Nagarjuna has a very a significant place in Buddhist philosophy. He has, as I see it, propounded the Madhyamika philosophy, which is the philosophy as demonstrated in the Prajnaparamita Sutra. Madhyamika is regarded to be the highest school of thought in Buddhism. So in this, in understanding the reality of the external and internal world, it's very important that the philosophy of Madhyamika tells us that the entire world is interdependent, and they do not have any inherent existence, they do not have any essential existence, but they are interdependently originated.
Then in the case of Nagarjuna, so without such established monastic universities, very big established monastic universities, how come that one individual person can have such coherent, very precise and able to articulate these concepts so beautifully? So how can that be possible? And then likewise, it is not just Nagarjuna. Then Nagarjuna's student, Arideva, for example, his writing, 400 stanzas. So you look at that, there's such a richness. So from these, I got the idea that, at the time of Nagarjuna and Arideva, there already must have been existing such a big monastic, so well-established monastic universities with a rich tradition, which a long tradition of intellectual rigor and the depth and sophistication. So from this, I would say that Nalanda University, which the history tells that it was at the time the Nagarjuna, I would say that should go even beyond Nagarjuna's time. For example, the present day the PhD students, when they submit their thesis, there's a particular sophistication in terms of formatting the thesis with footnotes and the major and the minor sources. And then there's a particular methodology by which to submit the thesis, by which to write the thesis. So if you by chance, if you find one such a thesis which happened to be as old as 2,000 years old, then from there you can easily say that, so look, this is just exactly a copy, or what we doing now in the modern universities is exactly a copy of this one, which existed 2,000 years ago. So from there, we can easily infer that such a sophisticated universities, what we have now, was actually there 2,000 years ago.
परम पावन दलाई लामा जी बीच बीच में कहते हैं, भारत जो है तिब्बत का गुरु है, ऐसा उन्होंने कहते हैं, क्योंकि जितना भी तिब्बत में जो धर्म के साथ में जो संस्कार आए हैं, कल्चर आए हैं, लैंग्वेज आए हैं, मेडिसिन का जो हेल्थ केयर का है, ये जितना भी कई चीज़ें तो इस तरह से भारत से आकर के आचार्य लोगों की कृपा से तिब्बत में आए हैं.
The high altitude plateau of Tibet, lying to the north of India, received Buddhism in the 7th century. King Songtsen Gampo had two wives who both followed the path of the Buddha. One queen was from Nepal and the other was from China. This led him to take a deep interest in the Buddhist faith.
The most overwhelmingly impressive and inspirational thing for me about the Tibetan traditions of Buddhism as received from India is the way in which those great masters of the past went to such incredible lengths to not only go and get those teachings and bring them to Tibet, but the masters, the Indian masters who travelled, went through incredible hardships, and they were willing to put those lives on the line or even sacrifice those lives for the good or the benefit of this much greater vision in which the whole of humanity, particularly perhaps the Tibetan people in the case of bringing Buddhism to Tibet, but in a larger picture than that, the whole of humanity in preserving those traditions for the future, preserving the knowledge, the wisdom, the meditative practices, the Vajrayana, the tantric practices, all those things, that great treasure of understanding and capacity for human beings to enlighten themselves.
History says, Dunkars give the references, when the Buddhism in Tibet developed in two phases. Now, one is early phase, other is later phase. First phase begins from 7th century to the end of the 9th century, means 842 something like that. In this period, from India, almost 51 scholars and the Pandits were invited. Then after a second phase of development, it is said almost 121 Indian scholars visited Tibet. They have contributed. They have revised the text which was earlier been translated.
And then beside that, from time to time, it is believed there were almost, I think, more than 600 Tibetans who visited India in a time span of 1,000 years to learn Buddhism and bring back whatever they have learned in India.
Tibet did not have a written script till the 7th century. The acceptance of the Buddhist faith entailed the understanding of subtle philosophic concepts and profound commentaries. This transfer of knowledge would not have been possible without translating and writing it down. A very sophisticated language and a script capable of preserving this knowledge had to be formulated.
Oh yes, Tibetan language or script is very much copy and very much similar. Because it's based on one of the ancient Indian script. Once Buddhism reached Tibet and started translation, then the vocabulary which in Buddhist tradition then translated into Tibetan, not available in Tibetan language, so created new words. So therefore eventually the Sanskrit vocabulary or Sanskrit terminology and Tibetan terminology go exactly the same.
Thonmi Sambuta created language at par with the Sanskrit because he was to translate those Sanskrit texts into the Tibetan. The Sanskrit language itself is a very highly elaborated and a very systematic language. To come at par with this language was not easy. To create this kind of language was not easy. In Sanskrit, all kind of human learning is being recorded, whether it's a medicine, whether it's a philosophy, whether it's a language, whether it's the art, whether it's the poetry, every human learning, that terminologies need to be translated into that newly created language. This is important. So what the Thonmi did in he has tried to create the Tibetan grammar as a Panini grammar. So what he did in putting this suffix and prefix words, that are the basic things, through which in Sanskrit also suffix, pratyaya and upsarga. When you put together, the meaning changes. And they also created same kind of suffix and prefix word in Tibetan language. So this language became potent enough to translate Sanskrit word into Tibetan in exactly in the same meaning and the same purpose.
The translations are done word by word and sentences by sentences. So therefore, this precision that is maintained in Tibetan is unparalleled.
It was in the 8th century that Acharya Shantarakshita of the Nalanda University was invited to Tibet to teach Buddhism. He brought with him a great system of monastic teaching, which was based upon a deep study of the principles of logic. He taught the Tibetans to focus on fundamental concepts such as what is our knowledge based upon? What is knowledge itself?
The Acharya Shantarachit, the first person who established Buddhism in Tibet, and he emphasized the Tibetan people to learn the Buddhism not by faith but by reasoning, by logician, and by analyzing the things for oneself, as Buddha had told, not to believe which has been said by Buddha, but to understand by oneself through analyzation and through a rational mind.
There were some practitioners, but there were no tradition of monkhood in Tibet, in Tibetan community. So Shantarakshit has greatest contribution in establishing the monastic community in Tibet.
So what he did was that while the richness, the main content of this whole legacy, which is in the form of philosophy, so that he started to impart by means of the logic. So he introduced logic there in Tibet. So with the study of logic, then you can't really escape. You can't really have room for diluting the concept. So the logic is like a very precise container. So with this container, you can see what is really there. The measurement is so accurate. So there, the philosophy, which is like the content of this the container of the logic, it was so freshly preserved in Tibet. So then it happened in 8th century. So now is 21st century. Already, like say, 13th century is gone. Still, you go to the great monastic universities in South India, Tibetan, the monastic universities. There, the amount of the rigor involved in terms of logic, study of logic, amount of the rigor and the subtleties, subtle nuances involved in the study of philosophy. This tradition, which started like 1,000 years ago, it can go so well, it can go so fittingly with the contemporary present-day academic standards. So I would say, if not better, surely it's not less. So this is the amazing tradition, which I think the Indians should really take pride in it. This is the legacy. This is the treasure of India.
So I think Tibetan quite fond, use Nalanda name. Now, for example, the last, I think, about 600 years, I think less than 600 years, the Debu Monastery, the biggest number of monk students, I think, all over Tibet. So usually we call Tibetan Nalanda. Usually we call it, we fond, to use, describe it that way. So then important is, another important, all the text which I think Gajyu, Nyingma, Sajja, Gilu, and Chonang, all these, I think, major tradition among the follower of this tradition, they all you should study the text which wrote by Nalanda masters like Nagarjuna, Buddhapalita, Aryandeva, Vabhaviga, and Chandakirti, Dignath, and Arya Asanga, Bosuband, Digna Dharmakirti, and the Chandakirti, and then like Naroba. All these formerly Nalanda scholars. So all Tibetan tradition, you see, come from each different tradition. Their original sort of masters all come from Nalanda. So I usually used to describe Tibetan Buddhist tradition is a pure lineage of Nalanda tradition. So I also, you see, start from age from 6, 7, already start memorizing these texts of Nalanda. At that time, I do not know who is the author of these texts and come from which sort of was the institution. I have no idea.
Atisha was another great teacher who was persuaded to go to Tibet in the 11th century. He had studied at Nalanda and was a teacher at the Vikramshila University, also in Bihar. He helped to make the philosophy understandable to common Tibetans.
Once Atisha was in Tibet, he was so impressed by the devotion of the Tibetan people and the need of a great scholar like him in the Tibet. So he chose to remain in Tibet rather than going back to India. And Tibetans are very grateful for his decision.
Perhaps his unique genius was to be able to take all of this very esoteric information and condense it into a form that could be understood and used by anyone. Another very interesting aspect of universal knowledge is that it can be condensed and transported. Atisha was also instrumental in the condensation of this knowledge so that it could be taken out of the university context, perhaps transported into another culture, and then take root. And this is one of the things that happened in Tibet in the 11th century.
He was amazingly learned, and his signature kind of text, the light to the path, the lamp to the path to enlightenment. This text formed the basis for the later school of the Gelugpas under Tsongkhapa, and formed the basis for the gradual path to enlightenment, the Lamrim, that became the signature of that school. This particular path, became of such huge importance in Tibet, and yet Atisha was one master of many in India. And I think perhaps when you consider that lineage of masters that came, you can say that they must have represented a very small number of those who were in existence in India at the time. And yet those masters in Tibet now, whose works have continued, have been preserved there in a way in which Indian Buddhism wasn't preserved in India. And so in that sense, the Tibetans have played a hugely important role for the planet, if you consider these teachings of great value.
So the gist of the idea is that we all seek happiness. We all like to avoid suffering. Now the question is, how can we do that? How can we do that? And in fact, originally the Buddha said that all these sufferings that we encounter with, the root is the ego. The root is the ignorance which distorts the perception of the reality. Then this is the trigger point from which the whole philosophy, the logic and everything of Buddhism came out. As Buddha pointed out, then our Nagarjuna elaborated, saying that this ignorance, it is like you in a dream. So now all these great masters in the different traditions of Buddhism, they were trying to explain what is dream like. it was such a wonderful tradition, you know. And debating with someone else, it is not considered as an offense, you know. This is more like a kind of tradition. And this, I think, is the real strength of knowledge. In fact, this is the greatest avenue whereby there is the development of the knowledge happening.
We know about a few of the great teachers of the Nalanda University owing to the writings of the Tibetans. What a place Nalanda must have been, and what a great society it must have been out of which all this was born. A society which gave so much importance to rational thinking and the logical search for knowledge. Truly an intellectual society.
Nalanda may have produced thousands of great scholars throughout the time. His Holiness Dalai Lama has enlisted 17 kind of leading outstanding scholars of Nalanda monastery throughout the time, and he composed a prayer to all those 17 outstanding scholars.
Firstly, I wrote poem praising each of the master. I made clear each sort of scholar's special field, specialty. Then made set of these masters' Thangka painting.
The universities of the plains of Bihar in medieval India had to have been incredible places to be at the time. When you think about the thousands and thousands of monks and scholars that were concerned with the most important things every day, year in and year out, we must understand that there was something incredibly special going on here. This was not a pastime. These were the most important aspects of human experience that were being developed, concentrated on for the good of humanity. Imagine something like that. Here in the modern world, we're used to thinking of everything as being marketing-driven and money-driven. This instead is being driven by the evolution of consciousness, the growth of consciousness, the growth of compassion.
I think since Buddhism flourished in Tibet, whole Tibetan way of life changed. Buddha come from India. So therefore, we Tibetan, you see, look India as something Arya Bhumi, a very sacred sort of land. Tibetan, then you should consider such Tibetan who once, you see, went to India, some study and speak Sanskrit or Pali, and they have, you see, a little bit sort of higher kasota status. India, sacred land. Anything from India is something very sacred, very holy.
The monasteries re-established in South India are of the larger monastic institutions in Tibet. And they continue the traditional study of the all Tripitak through its commentaries, and particularly His Holiness has named out 17 Nalanda scholars who have written most important commentaries on the Buddha's teaching, and which are studied in South Indian monasteries.
It's very important to have contemplation, discussion, and the debates. If we do debate with a kind of an intention to just to win and to just to defeat someone, and that kind of approach really doesn't help that much to make the debate productive. The Tibetan Buddhist scholars has learned this approach of the Nalanda scholars. And then, upon that, a great contribution the Tibetans had added up is the way of debate that you see at present day. You see nowadays, the monks, when they do the debate, they clap. There are very fixed votes to ask questions and answer those questions.
Buddha himself, you see, they advise us, "Oh, my follower, bhikshus and scholars should not accept my teaching out of faith and devotion, but rather through thorough investigation and experiment." So that way of approach is, I think, very suitable in modern time. And the scientific-minded people, you see, loves that kind of way of approach. So perhaps I think in modern time, see, people who not easily sort of accept things, rather through investigation, experiment. So such people finds Buddhist way of approach is more realistic, more practical.
When we talk about religion from the Western approach, they have a different kind of connotation of it. When we talk about the religion from Indian approach, that means something different.
In the Indic civilizations, I think one could go much wider and much deeper. You could ask questions: why are we here? What is the nature of God? What is the nature of the self? What is the purpose of human existence? You know, these things are the subject of great dialogues. It's much closer to the Socratic dialogues. The Socratic Plato dialogues are very much of the same pattern as the Indic dialogues. Yoga, remember, is the most fundamental and profound study into the human mind ever undertaken. And modern psychoanalysis is only just beginning to touch the fringes of what... I'm not talking, when I talk of yoga, not only the exercises, which are known as yoga generally, but of the much deeper yoga, the inner yoga, the study of consciousness. That is something, I think, that the West can learn a lot from India.
His Holiness the Dalai Lama, His Holiness puts it so beautifully. If you understand this, the wisdom of interdependency as taught in the Nalanda University teachings, then you may not be a Buddhist. You can be, Hindu, you can be Christian, but you will be a wonderful Christian. And you will be, the environmentalist, you will be a wonderful environmentalist. So this knowledge is a pure knowledge. It has nothing to do with dogma. It has nothing to do with, a religion as such. So therefore, I call it as a legacy of India, the legacy of the world. So it must not disappear. It must remain for long.
This search for the truth was not restricted to the universities of ancient and medieval India. It was shared by the common people. Even till recently, you could have a sophisticated intellectual discussion about Maya or Mithya, the illusory nature of the material world around us, with even the most common Indians.
India is an extraordinary country. Mother India, really, Mother India. India is one of the most religious, wrong word, the most spiritual countries on earth, because Indian people have a very deep understanding of the spiritual life. Scratch an Indian, you can have a spiritual discussion. It's absolutely extraordinary. It doesn't matter who you meet, taxi driver to a cabinet minister. Absolutely universal situation. The benefit of the Buddhist culture is that Buddhism promotes tolerance, it promotes learning, it promotes spirituality in collaboration with technical progress, rather than spirituality standing against technical progress, which has been such a problem as the world modernizes. And it's trying to get those two forces side by side.
In the history of human civilization, India has been one of the great originators of culture and religion. Indian culture has done for the East what the Greek and Roman culture together did for the West. And therefore you will find all the way from Afghanistan to Indonesia and all the way to Japan and China and Korea and all the countries of South and Southeast Asia has the impact of Indian culture on their language, on their customs, on their art, on their music. It has been an extraordinary saga.
One of the great miracles in the story of man is the spread of ideas across formidable natural barriers of high mountains and vast seas. Ideas do not know political and national boundaries. The ready acceptance of the ideas of life by the people of faraway lands underlies the sameness of human life and the human condition everywhere. Perhaps the greatest example of the travel of ideas is the vast spread of the Indic concepts of Buddhism and Hinduism in ancient times. These ideas were warmly accepted wherever they went. From Sri Lanka in the south to Mongolia in the north, from the river Volga in the west to Japan in the east. This spread was not through military conquests, but simply through Indian traders. The people who heard them talking about philosophical matters wished to know more. Here was a philosophic vision which appeared to bring peace and happiness in one's life. Therefore, Indian teachers were cherished and sought.
So therefore, I always describe, or when I met Indian, I always say, you are traditionally our guru. We are Chela. You Indian are our guru. Then also I mentioned, we Tibetan, not only Indian gurus Chela, but also quite a reliable Chela. That means in guru's own land, Buddha Dharma, a lot of ups and downs. During this period, your Chela, kept throughout, you see, through centuries, we kept your knowledge intact. So we are quite a reliable Chela. So our relation is something very unique, Guru and Chela.